you, and that we should be going live, and I am going to disappear.
Okay, I think we're live. It's that pause moment, like, are we live? Are we not live? So welcome everybody to the Existing Mythologies panel at QuaranCon 2021. If this wasn't the panel you were expecting, that's okay. Hang out, stick around, grab a cup of coffee, grab a cocktail, depending on your time zone, and let's talk mythology. I would like our panelists to introduce themselves, and let's start with Antoine.
Hey, my name is Antoine Bandele. I am a indie author of mostly Black and African diaspora works, and that is specifically what I do with mythology in particular, because I was very much wanting to see more of those stories, especially now with my contemporary piece that is sort of in line with that, the idea of like Percy Jackson, like a kid who's interacting with mythology in the modern age. That is like my main focus right now.
Awesome. And can you tell us what the name of your book series is, super quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So the one in particular that I was just referring to, that I'm probably going to be talking about the most today, is called T.J. Young and the Orishas, and the first book is called The Gatekeeper's Staff.
Awesome. Thank you. And Eli, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, your books, the mythology that you use, super quick?
Yes, my name is Eli Hinze, and I mostly draw from the Mesopotamian mythology and that pantheon, which reaches out a little bit into Canaanite, Hittite, etc. mythology. I authored the Queen of Shades series, 4-book series, and in all of my other books too, I draw on that mythology. So those are my main projects.
Awesome. Gabriela, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, the mythologies you draw on, and what your book series is, please?
Okay. So I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm a debut fantasy author. My book, which is, careful product placement here of a second bell, has very subtle. I'm very subtle like that. Has just come out from Angry Robot in March, and it draws on Slavic mythologies.
I that right now.
Yeah, well, I wasn't even aware until quite recently that like there is like a more of the trend, especially in the US. But I live in the UK and I'm Polish originally, so I'm interested in a lot of mythologies, but for this particular book, I draw on Slavic mythologies.
Great, thank you. And is it JC or James? Which do you prefer?
On the book, it's JC, but I'm James.
Okay. James, go ahead. Why don't you introduce yourself to us? Tell us about the mythology that you use and about your book series.
Yeah, so my name's James Duncan, and I'm a debut self-published author working in the Viking, at the moment, working in the kind of Viking mythology and alternate history. And my interest is in our world, but asking questions about, what would have happened if things had been different. So my book, which I've also carefully placed next to me, is a story of what would happen if the Viking era didn't end relatively peacefully with a Christian conversion of the Norse culture, which is in itself very interesting, but is well understood. And what would have happened if they had resisted? And that's the idea behind that series, and the way that I bring mythology into the reasoning and kind of the how of how that would happen, and the way that the Christian and Norse mythologies and cultures would clash in that scenario. That's what I'm interested in at the moment.
That's awesome. Do all of you have a virtual table at QuaranCon this year?
I do not. I didn't even know that was a thing. I actually wanted to start doing tables, like tables before, we had.
We did it last year. I should have asked if they were doing it again this year. Okay, at the end of I want everybody that's watching to stick around to the end. All of these authors are going to tell you where to find them and their books, which is super important. So, I would like, and if any of you want to grab your paperbacks, believe me, I understand. I love flashing up my paperbacks. You will definitely, you can definitely flash it up there while you're talking about your mythologies and your books. Please feel free to do that. There we go, yeah. So let's dive right in. I want to expand a little bit on the specific myths that you used? And I'm looking down at the questions on my phone, by the way. Sorry about that, if I'm out of frame at all. I would like to know what the pantheon with the deities specifically, because a lot of these pantheons are huge. There's a lot to choose from. I really would love to know what deities you drew from and why those specific pantheons. Let's start with Eli.
Yes, so I primarily draw, like I said, from Mesopotamian myth. And though I've drawn bits and pieces from a lot of deities, I've mostly drawn from Ereshkigal, who is the goddess of the dead and the underworld. She is, of course, the primary lead in my books. Nergal, or Era, as he's sometimes called, who's the god of disease, the destructive aspect of war. He's actually mentioned in the Old Testament specifically for that. He's also supposed to be representative of the sun at high noon, because that was very destructive, which is very specific, and Ishtar, or Inanna, the goddess of sexuality and war. She's both of those.
Oh, so that's why okay, so I had a character named Ishtar, and I found it just through the meaning of the name, because I like having meanings in my name. I was like, I did not know that came from Mesopotamian mythology. That's actually awesome.
Yes, and later on, whenever she evolves into Aphrodite, Aphrodite is often coupled with Ares, the god of war. So they kind of neutered her and gave it to him, but they still have that connection. So those are the myths that I primarily draw from.
So why that pantheon? What drew you to that one specifically?
The first Mesopotamian myth I ever read was Descent of Inanna for school. And because we were focusing on myths just that dealt with death and rebirth and justice. And so we read that one, and it was seeing how ingrained Mesopotamian mythology was in our world. But a lot of people, if you tell them, find Mesopotamia on a map, it'd probably be a little difficult. It's something that's incredibly familiar to us, but we can't put a name to it. Things like the flood myth, the tree of knowledge, Persephone, underworld myth. Those are all things that we're incredibly familiar with, and they all originate in Mesopotamia.
That is incredible. I was hearing you talk before the panel started about how you can find so many of these references to these myths in the Old Testament. And I was listening to it while I was doing something else. I was like, oh my gosh, she's so right. Like, I remember reading the Old Testament and picking up on those threads and just thinking, this is fascinating, the connection of these different pantheons and how we have so many common myths like the flood. I mean, it's such a common myth in ancient mythology. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, and there's over 100 myths, over 100 different accounts of a flood myth. And to think that either there was a huge flood, or they all have a common myth, or both. And small things like there was a woman who was created to heal Enki. Specifically, she was supposed to heal his rib. She was known as the Rib Lady.
And we know who that is.
Eventually it's like, we have a woman who comes from a rib. Like, interesting little connections like that. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but it's fascinating.
Well, I think the flood myth is because of the rivers, right? The Tigris and the Euphrates. Those often flooded.
They often flooded, and some people posit that after the end of the Little Ice Age, there was a lot more flooding. There are also theories that there was more of a regional flood around, what we think of today as the Levant. But also it floods in a lot of places. It's one of those things that it could be talking about a specific historical event.
I've heard frequently that it's referring to the flooding of the Black Sea area when the gates of the Bosphorus opened up. Essentially, they were a river. They eventually opened, and there's archaeological evidence of towns at the bottom of the Black Sea. So it was land at some point. And I've heard a lot of connection that the flood myths originate from that.
Yeah. And it could reference multiple events.
But you've blown my mind, because your description of your goddess just sounds like Freya from Norse mythology. She was the goddess of war and sexuality. And
they're all connected. And that's what I love about it.
That's just killed me, because now I'm just going to spend the rest of my evening researching, does Norse mythology come from Mesopotamian mythology?
I honestly believe, like with Proto-Indo-European languages, I honestly believe that there is probably a Proto-Indo-European goddess who a lot of these deities originate from.
Well, and you have, go ahead, Gabriela.
There are like a lot of connections when you see, for example, things that you wouldn't think are connected in any way, like, Slavic, sort of proto-Slavic mythologies, and some Hindu gods and texts. There's some striking similarities, and even into a modern like Polish language, as there's certain similarities from this kind of Sanskrit words, like pięć means five and pięć means five in Polish and Sanskrit. So, and there's a similarity between goddess Kali and Morana, who's like a goddess of death and rebirth and sort of cyclical. But it's what you were saying, I found very interesting about how the woman-centric myths were then taken and sort of, and the women were basically sort of stripped of their power in the different reiterations of the original myths, because that is a very strong motif, not just from Mesopotamian to like, Greek and Roman traditions, but also when the sort of Christianity took over in certain parts of the world, like in the Slavic lands, you see how the goddesses became either saints, if they really couldn't be eradicated in their positive reiteration, or they became demons.
That is exactly the same with Yoruba and the Orisha. It's the same thing, because Catholicism was the thing that was mixing with that. And they were like, well, if we can't demolish it, let's just make them the same. And Santeria came from that. And then the idea of like, okay, well, it's your guardian angel, but also that just used to be your Orisha back in the motherland. So it's just all of this is great. I love this panel so much already.
I'm making notes for new questions. I just want you guys to know that. because yeah, we'll get to that. I want to give each of you a chance to talk about your pantheons, but I could let you guys go for the rest of the hour, and I think everybody'd be happy.
I just want to talk about Eli's pantheon now. Everyone knows about Thor. I know nothing about Mesopotamia.
I remember studying Mesopotamian alongside of Greco-Roman in junior high, and I was like, forget the Greco-Romans, I want to know more about the Mesopotamian gods. These people are amazing. Okay, Antoine, why don't we talk about you were touching on the Orisha, or how do you pronounce that? Orishas? Orisha.
Yeah.
You were touching on them, but tell us a little bit more about that pantheon. What drew you to that? What are the deities that you are drawing from in your work?
So I'm drawn to it probably based on my last name. So my last name is not actually my birth name. I was born Antoine William Bailey, but then my dad did some research about like what that last name came from, and he thought it came from like, I mean, it comes from it's an Irish name, and he thought that was like from the slave situation. Turns out later on when I did like my 23andMe, I realized that that's actually from marriage, and it was French and German. That was the part that, brought us over. But he changed our last name when I was 7 to Bandele, which he found to be the meaning called born away from home. And then I had a Nigerian woman tell me like, oh, that's kind of like a mistranslation. It's actually Bamidele, which means follow me home, which I was like, that's still amazing both ways, because that's what I'm doing now with my mythology, is I am returning home to like, the motherland and finding out more about, my ancestral mythology and where I've come from. And it's very interesting, me doing this research, because there's all this history tied to the Orishas in the Americas, particularly in Brazil and South America, where it's most prominent. And the idea, like I was saying before, that it got mixed in with Catholicism because there's like saints there. And there's the idea of guardian angels. And that was already something that was in the Ifa faith system. And that just applied very easily. And people also did it in secret, because they'll praise one saint, but really be praising Eshu or praising Obatala, which are like, different kinds of pantheons. So yeah, the ones I draw from are specifically from West Africa, from Nigeria and Benin. And the Ifa people, the Ifa people or the Yoruba people are the ones who practice this. And I'm applying it to like my contemporary Percy Jackson-esque, young adult sort of fantasy. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to take away from too many other people, but that's like the gist of mine.
Could I ask a follow-up really quick?
Yeah.
Did the Orishas influence hoodoo and voodoo in the New Orleans culture?
They're so tied, like all, because obviously, with the slave trade, there was a lot of mixing of African people groups. So a lot of times you'll get a lot of intermixing between the Haiti voodoo or the Vodun, and then you got Kamdoble, Santeria, which I mentioned, Ifa. All of those have so much mixing in it. Like, Nancy the spider is another really famous myth from Ghana, from the Akan people, that ends up, getting mixed in with the Orisha sometimes. So it's really fascinating, like all of that. But yeah, all of those, they're separate. If you hear those separate names, they do have separate practices and they have separate origins, but because of the nature of the slave trade, like they got intermixed.
That makes so much sense. Gabriela, is it okay? So is there a role with the R? I want to pronounce your name correctly. Gabriela or
Gabriela.
Gabriela.
Oh my God, I can't trill. I cannot trill. That's so hard for me.
Well, don't worry if you can't.
I want to try. I don't want to butcher it though. So tell us a little bit more about your pantheon. What drew you to that specific one, and what are some of the specific deities that you are using in your works?
I mean, so like I said, I came to the UK when I was 19, which was a long time ago. And, I'm Polish. So obviously there was this influence of like Slavic folklore and Slavic mythologies in the stories that I was read to as a child. And then I kind of moved away from it, and I was more excited about that kind of, Celtic mythologies, Norse mythologies, Greco-Roman, a little smattering of Egyptian. So I was really interested in all of that. And then I kind of came back to the Slavic mythologies a bit later. I think it's what draws me to Slavic mythologies was this, for all that essentially they're a mess in terms of there's no canon, right? There was virtually nothing preserved in terms of written text, so like in Norse mythologies or Greek mythologies and Celtic, like you have those written texts that you can refer to, and there is some, even with the gaps, it is some kind of a canon. With Slavic mythologies, not so much. So what we know now is everything is always contentious, and you have this, it's all pieced together using archaeologists and linguists and historical linguists are carefully piecing together things from local folkloric sort of fairy tales and superstitions and songs and all that, and and it all amounts to quite a bit, but there's nothing in the sense that people will get offended if you write it in a slightly different way, which gives a certain freedom that you don't have if you're rewriting Iliad, for example, right?
There are so many overlaps. It's crazy because it's also like mine is also oral tradition, so it's a lot of freedom to it, a lot of interpretation, a lot of different. Like I'll read one story that has a different like gender, applied to one deity, and then it's all different.
And you can do it because who will know?
Yeah, I mean that's what happens when you have oral, right? Like that's the gist. So I have a question for you actually. So the main feature that I know about Slavic mythology is this idea of duality. Is that actually like an actual? Okay, yes, you're like nodding. Yeah.
It's really interesting that you've picked up on it, because it's very there's a very strong sort of theme running through Slavic mythology of there's a sense of a duality of the soul. There's this idea in some texts that humans actually have two souls. One is the kind of immortal soul that comes back again, and then the other half is the human soul, which needs to rest after you die. So so there is that, and also, there's also this sense of like what really appeals to me in Slavic mythology is that the sense that there's this that we have those parallel worlds, right? There's this human world and there's this world that we can't necessarily see but exists all around us, that there's sort of spirits and creatures that live sort of just beyond our line of vision, right? Like the famous monster sort of Upior, which will follow you and it will kill you, but you can only ever see it in the corner of your eye, like just beyond your vision. So you will get a hint that you're being followed, but you will never actually see it. And I mean, obviously there's elements like, it's really dark. Slavic mythology is really dark and creepy, which appeals to me personally. But of course, I don't know how much of that is the direct result of Christian influence on the way we perceive those old stories and those old sort of mythologies. But there is this sense that there's this sort of danger lurking everywhere around you, and you have to know the rules, and the rules are very specific in terms of, what if you go into the forest, what do you have to do? What do you have to say? If you encounter a certain creature, how do you behave? There's also this context of like this very transactional relationship between humans and the creatures of the other world, who, if they don't want to kill you, they are at best ambivalent towards your existence in general, and you have to figure out a way to work with them, or or at least to sort of survive. You have to figure out a way to bargain and with that other world, and I find that tremendous.
Everyone's mythology is so freaking it's so interesting. So interesting.
I mean, all mythologies are amazing.
They really
all mythologies are amazing. It's like humans are great storytellers, right? And we apply our best skills to our religions, basically, when it comes to storytelling. So of course, it's all really interesting.
I thought it was really interesting. This idea of Christianity kind of seems to be implanted in a lot of our, it's like a through line for everyone, right? And the idea of, like you were saying, like the darkness, do you think it comes from Christianity? And it's a similar thing with Ifa. It's like, there's a trickster god that's in the pantheon, and they equate that to the devil, but it's like, no, there really isn't a good and evil kind of sense in the mythology that is implanted by Christianity, which seems to be like a through line for everyone. I wonder, James, do you also have something?
You're all just talking about Norse mythology.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there something similar, right? Yeah.
I mean, Gabriela's talking about, this oral tradition that's only passed down like that. And I'm fascinated with the oral traditions and the way that stories passed down. And so much of Norse culture is about oral mythology. They didn't write anything down. The really interesting thing about Norse mythology is that it was written by Christians. Snorri, who is the most famous of the Icelandic poets, was a Christian, and he was writing about Norse mythology from a Christian perspective. Thus, inevitably, almost all of the Icelandic sagas were written by Christians, and because the Norse in their own time didn't write very much down, and everyone will go, well, what about runes? Yes, absolutely. That's the one main exception, is that the Norse themselves left a lot of rune stones. They were typically burial markers and that kind of thing. Here lies Olaf Big Shoulders, who killed whatever, Magnus the Hairy Foot in 800, and they list their deeds and everything. And they do give you little snapshots of Norse life. And you think I'm joking, but they did have names like Olaf Hairy Shoulders and worse.
I think it's awesome, actually.
It's fabulous.
I love it.
And so, one of the most famous kings of Norway in the late Norse era was, suddenly his name escapes me, but Magnus Barefoot. Big, scary king of Norway, barefoot. I don't know. They had strange names. But when you're talking about, Gabriela, the oral traditions and stuff, and then Antoine, everything you're talking about just resonates for me. So I think a lot of these cultures are intermixing a lot more. I knew they were intermixing, but they're intermixing a lot more than I thought they were. And the Vikings were great travelers, and they, they're one of the most traveled peoples in that era. They had a trade network that went the whole way from India, around North Africa, all the way up to the Greenland and even North American areas. So I'm sure they just were very multicultural people. And one of the things you said earlier is about the way women are excluded from a lot of Christian-centric mythologies, because the Catholic Church wasn't
changed into a demon or something.
Yeah, and one of the things I really like about Norse mythology is that the women in it are not disempowered like that. Freya is one of the three key deities in the Norse pantheon. She's the goddess of war, the goddess of fertility, and the goddess of love and sexuality, and so many key things. And women were responsible for choosing the brave warriors, or female deities were responsible for choosing brave warriors to go to Valhalla. So basically, as a Norseman, if you died in battle, you had to have impressed a woman in order to go to heaven. That's a horrible, you know,
but even that, you know, I found it very interesting how we're looking at the old sort of certain mythologies, and you know, we have this concept of what the canon is that was sort of written down, like you say, by monks, and we look at it through very patriarchal lens. Because, you know, like the recent discoveries of that, like, you know, 50% of some warriors that were, you know, discovered, like that were killed in battle, like Viking warriors, were actually women. But before, when they were originally sort of dug up, they were all just assumed to be men.
Absolutely.
You know, forensics person came in and said, like, wait, these are women. You do see the bones. You do see the hip structure. These are women, and it was just a given that all those warriors were men. So, and I wonder how much of that is because the monks writing the texts down couldn't conceive that a woman could hold a certain position, so they just downgraded them. In, you know, not even on purpose. They just, like, they couldn't conceive that this was truly the women's sort of position. It's like kind of when you have Romans taking over the Etruscan, ancient Etruscan lands, right? And I went to this museum once with, sorry, but so this is a bit of a digression. Etruscans were matriarchal, right? So women inherited the land, and the name of the mother went down to the child. And when the Romans came, the part of the thing was that the burial had to follow the Roman style. And they would sort of insist that you had to write down the name in a Roman style with the father's name. But often they would make a mistake because the local people just didn't understand what they were on. So when they were writing it down, he was, you know, the father was so-and-so, and it was actually the mother, but they just got confused, you know, because they couldn't conceive of a world where the shoe was on the other foot, you know. So.
And the Etruscans, they're finding out, were actually where the Romans got the myth of the Amazons. The Etruscan female warriors were actually the root.
Because they were matriarch. Okay, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. And most of their warriors were female. It was this huge rite of passage for them. The only reason I know that is because I'm completely obsessed with the myths of Amazons specifically. So I didn't mean to butt into the conversation, but when you mentioned the Etruscans, I got really excited.
Hey, this conversation does that. It's exciting talking about history and myths. It really is.
It really is. I want to make sure that James had the chance, though, to talk about how he put that in his books super quickly. And then I would like to go on talking a little bit more in depth about the certain pantheons and how they treated women, etc.
I do want to say that this is not actually just an excuse to show off my book again, but this warrior here is a woman. This is a photograph that I arranged for, you know, PR photos for the book and for the covers and stuff. And she is a HEMA specialist. And this guy here, who's actually holding the sword that is the focus of the book, is a guy. And she was teaching him how to fight. And I'm bored of the sort of Christianic online idea that women can't fight, they're not strong enough, and it is rubbish. Weapons are light, they're easy to use for anyone who has an arm, and there's absolutely nothing that stops women from being warriors or fighting other than the society that they're in. And the Norse society was in many ways perfect for female warriors. I dislike the term shield maiden because I think it's a sort of male fantasy thing where they're the beautiful young warrior princesses, which, you know, in films you never see sort of middle-aged women who look like life has chewed on them.
The moment you put a maiden in there, it's just like, it's a
sort of sexualized fantasy, I think. But female warriors were undoubtedly going to be common in Viking times for several reasons. Firstly, because they weren't a Christian society, and they had a strong emphasis on you know, the female power. And secondly, there weren't very many of them. And if your country, your tribe, your area is under attack, and, you know, are you imagining the women don't fight for their homes? Of course they do. Of course they can. Here's a typical era weapon. This is a sax. Some people would use this as a secondary weapon. Some people would use this as a primary weapon. a child can use this. You know, I'm not suggesting they should, by the way. But so in answer that, you know, in answer to that, there's no doubt in my mind that female warriors were commonplace. You know, to what extent they were involved in Viking raids, which is a kind of separate thing, is unknown. But yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that female warriors were commonplace, because why wouldn't they be? The only reason why they wouldn't is because the Christian world suppressed women and didn't allow them to. It's not because they in any way couldn't. And back to the original question in terms of how I've weaved that into my book. My book is what I would call semi-fantasy. It is a historical fiction with a sprinkle of fantasy. So I like to reference the mythology in it. I like the characters to kind of relate almost some of it. Some of the sagas and stories that we know now were in existence at the time. So they are aware of them as well. And also I like to put references in there. So Brunhild, who is a famous Valkyr and a figure in Norse mythology, is not in the book as an all-powerful goddess, but there is a character in the book called Brunhild. And throughout her storyline, you're going to see a lot of references to the mythological Brunhild, and you're going to see a lot of parallels and similarities. So I like to weave the fantasy into my book in a more subtle way, not because I think that's better, it's just that I'm trying to make a more realistic, you know, could have happened book. And there's a sprinkle of magical fantasy, you know, in there, and divine intervention and stuff as well.
It's very Assassin's Creed-esque, because it's very similar, where Assassin's Creed is historical, like as a foundation, but then has a little twinkle of like the mythology.
Yeah, just a little sprinkle, you know, just a little seasoning, a seasoning of fantasy.
Eli, I think I saw you trying to say something a few minutes ago. Did you have something that you wanted to bring up?
Just merely that thank you, James, for saying that women are great warriors. I did tournament fighting for like 8 years, and women have a lower center of gravity, a lot more flexible, and so that can present an advantage in certain areas. That's all I was going to say. Smaller,
can be faster, have better endurance, higher pain tolerance, lighter. There's so many reasons why women make, you know, good warriors. And
that's the huge thing too, the pain tolerance thing, like in particular, like that gets overlooked all the time, and it's extremely important.
And to put it brutally, especially in that era, there was one particular target that was a very vulnerable thing for men in a battle line, and the armor didn't really protect it. And women did not have that disadvantage. And that's not a joke. That's a real thing. There's a lot of treatises and books from the Middle Ages on fighting that say, hey, target this. No one's doing any fighting after they've been stabbed there. So, you know.
This is a question that wasn't on the list, but it was brought up several times as all of you talked about the pantheons. I find it fascinating that female deities are not, generally speaking, not just goddesses, excuse me, of fertility and love, but war is often thrown in there or in some way associated with them. Like you said, Eli, the goddess Aphrodite is oftentimes heavily associated with the god Ares. Can you guys talk a little bit about why? Why is war and blood and all of that connected with love and growing crops and having children? Gabriela, could you start us off with that conversation?
Well, I do have children, and I can tell you definitely that blood does have something to do with that. It's not, so you can't, you know, there is, you know, I think, you know, when you have this sort of concept of women as kind of life givers, there is certainly death and life have never been very far away from each other, especially in a kind of pre-modern, pre-industrial times, and even past that. So there is some kind of, there is definitely this connection that is made in many mythologies, the sort of connection of the feminine element to the cyclical nature of the world. So you have the seasons, you have and in many mythologies you have the Demeter, you know, the goddess of crops basically, and vegetation in general. And you have on the Slavic side, of course, you have Morana or Marzanna, which we but there's still a custom in spring, in March, we Polish people throw a hay figure of a woman into a river. Sort of, this is a death of winter, and then the Marzanna, she's reborn. as the warmer season.
Mhm.
So I think there is that connection, definitely, and depending on what the culture's attitude to women in general, this can be taken to this kind of this can be sort of taken to its very like bare minimal kind of like, so this is all that women are, or it can be expanded. And in many cultures you do have and in many mythologies you do have those more powerful female figures who sort of grasp that power of the kind of cyclical nature of life and death, and they deal death as well as they do life, and that's in pretty much all pantheons, isn't it?
That's, yes, exactly. I love that. I love that what you said about death and life being so intertwined and so close to each other. And I think it was a show called The Last Kingdom on Netflix, excuse me. And it was, kids were dying left and right in that show. And I had to remind myself, like, this idea of, our kids living, having a long childhood and all of that, growing to adulthood is a fairly modern thing, that back when all these mythologies were happening, infant mortality was very high. So I love that you brought that up, because and that's what it reminded me of, was the fact that most of your kids probably would live to be teenagers. So James, do you have anything to add to that? Why love and death and war and crops and all of that are so intertwined in these mythologies?
Yeah, I agree too much with what Gabriela said to add much, other than the fact that, it is the duality of life and death. And I think having a goddess of war, who's also the goddess of love, it completes, I think, what we talked about right at the start, which is the circle of life. And so, in Norse mythology, the men are the gods of wisdom and, things like that, and sort of knowledge. And it was a patriarchal society. The men were the rulers, the men were the kings, the men were the jarls. It was very rare for women to have political power. But women had local and individual power, and in a way that they didn't in Christian society, and in most Christian societies. I'm not trying to bang on Christianity as a modern concept. We're talking about the historical side. So having a goddess that was just of war would make it an extremely dark and isolating figure who had no relevance to 90% of society, because unlike what television shows us, the vast majority of life in these times was not war. And all Viking warriors were farmers or fishermen or craftsmen or bladesmiths, as in this case. Viking was not a person. Viking was a job. Viking was something you did, not in your free time, but, in a summer season of raiding, you would go Viking. And the rest of the time you were a farmer. And so if you were a goddess that was just the goddess of war, you're unemployed 90% of the time. So having the goddess of war, being the goddess of life, who is the giver and the taker of lives, is just poetic and artistic. And I think it makes a lot of sense.
Antoine, do you have anything to add from your pantheon?
Not much, except for the idea that there is one named Oya, who is the goddess of war. She's a warrior spirit, but also very compassionate. And I like her always a lot to like a Hufflepuff, right? Like the badger, the idea that, you're very protective, you're very kind, but once someone comes at you or comes for your people, then you've got to turn that on. Yeah, I turn like that mama bear like effect on, right? So I would say like that little addition, but also the idea that in terms of females in the pantheon, they're extremely respected within Ifa and like the Orishas. Like it's very ritualistic, and also just like bad juju and stuff like that. So like anytime you mess with someone who might be aligned with one of the female Orishas, like it's known like in the society, like don't do that, or that female is going to get you, because it's very much of the idea of that mother protector kind of feel. And that's that divide between the two, because there's always that thin line, right, between love and hate. And if you break that thin line, then you can see both of those like emerge and cultivate.
Yeah, like the most dangerous bear is a mother bear with cubs. She is simultaneously nurturing a new life, and she will rip your face off if you threaten it, and I think that makes, that's why I think a lot of these deities are female, because it's by far the most just logical.
Eli, anything to add?
Quite a bit. I'll try to shrink it down. In talking about, some proto-Indo-European figure, we see in Indian myth, for instance, that, the very, very far back myths, an untethered woman was seen as too dangerous. So she needed to be married off. It was seen as she had an incredibly destructive power. So a lot of the, like you see Durga, Kali, and I think that's one of the interesting things you'll see with Inanna is a lot of y'all are talking about love and warfare. Inanna is not the goddess of love. She's not the goddess of children. She is the goddess of sex.
And solely sex.
Lust. It says lust, sex, warfare. Battle was literally called the Dance of Inanna. She has nothing to do with children. She does have a lot to do with crop fertility. She's that like restless life energy. She is very tumultuous, but she has not a nurturing bone in her body.
Can I just slip a question in there? Sorry for Ellie. So how do we know all that? What kind of are we getting all those sort of?
So that's one of the interesting things is a lot of y'all are talking about these oral traditions, and yes, a lot of them all Mesopotamian mythology was oral, but they had such great record keeping back then. Every transaction, even each party of the transaction would have their own copy on clay, and the temple where the transaction took place would also have a copy. So we have so many myths, and Inanna is perhaps one of the goddesses who has the most documentation on her, because Sargon of Akkad, one of the conquerors, one of the most well-known rulers of this time, his daughter Enheduanna was a priestess of Inanna. And we have tons of hymns, epics, etc. with her. And her nature is perhaps outside of tax documents, one of the things we have the most writings on. And it's known that she has a ton of, she has a ton of lovers, but never does she has some children, but it's not something that's talked about a lot. A lot of her children go on to become like conquerors. And that was the overwhelming part of her nature. She was vitality and life, but not specifically the childbearing aspect.
It's sex and taxes. It's interesting when you look at the old
incredibly influential
old culture.
Sex and money, that's all it boils down to, right?
Yeah, and so she was the patron goddess of a lot of cities, but then you see throughout the march of time, she's gradually replaced with male deities such as Marduk, and kind of weakened over time, neutered, and to where she evolves from Inanna to Ishtar to Astarte to Asherah to Aphrodite, where she has nothing to do with war. She will dally with war a little bit in the form of Ares, but she's been stripped of a lot of her more warlike, more aggressive qualities.
So we have a question really quickly from Gregory Amato. How influenced have you all been by previous writers using mythology versus the source texts? And James, would you like a first stab at this question?
Sure. I love both. I read the Icelandic sagas. I didn't read all of them. They're actually quite dense to read because they're translated from Icelandic and Old Norse, and it's actually quite hard to read in English. But I've read through them, and I've taken a lot from that. The sort of semi-mythical sword, which you see behind me over here in the flesh, is based on a sword that's in one of the King's sagas, the saga of King Hendrik the Wise, where they talk of this sword that blazes with light in battle. And so the Light of the North, which is that sword, is kind of semi-based on that particular piece of Norse sagas. But I also, I've read Giles Christian's Viking novels, and I've read, other people, who have interpreted, modern kind of Viking and Norse stories, and I take from them as well. I'm greedy with my, with my inspiration, and I like to sort of gather a little of, realistic stuff and a little of the kind of fictional stuff. And I'm not particularly fussy about it. I'm not writing a scholarly article. I don't mind people coming on Twitter and saying, well, actually, you were wrong about that.
Right.
Because sometimes those conversations are quite interesting. I'm not pretending to be the world's expert on Norse mythology. I'm just having fun with it. And I try and be realistic and logical without necessarily being accurate, which is great because it means I can just basically, take it from anywhere. And because a lot of Viking mythology was either a bit fuzzy or was just made up after the Norse era. For example, we're not actually sure that Valhalla was a real thing in the Viking times. It's only mentioned twice in contemporary texts, and both very obliquely. It wasn't until after the Viking era that it was really fleshed out as a myth. So, you can have fun with it, because why not? Because they did, even at the time.
Antoine, do you want to take a stab at that question? How much did you draw from authors that have used that pantheon versus source material?
Now, see, I wish I had more to draw from, and that's the sort of the reasoning of why I'm writing it, because there is, a little bit of, it's easier to do it if it's something that's based on something that has been like written to death or something that's really well covered, because then you can put your own spin on it if you have some sort of like additional commentary. But for me, yeah, it's very much in that I'm in that playing field of like, this is extremely open. Also the fact that the Pantheon of the Orishas is also very open just in general, because it is an oral based tradition. So yeah, for me, it's completely opposite. I'm just like, I just have an open playing field entirely. And I kind of do wish I had because sometimes when I'm writing, I'm like, same with you, James. Like sometimes I'm like, oh man, I don't know if I'm getting this completely right. But at the same time, I'm telling a narrative story that my focus is to tell that story, not necessarily to get that. And I actually do have like something at the beginning saying that, hey guys, this is actually a living practice. This is not an accurate depiction of the actual practice that people actually, do today. Which I wonder, that's another question I'll have after we have this, if everybody, is that something you guys also deal with too, with people who are still practicing some of these things in the modern era? But yeah, for me, it's completely open field.
I actually have that question written down because, because I think Gabriela talked about the ritual of putting the dolly made of hay in the water, and it got me thinking how many traditions we're still doing today that came from these mythologies. But I want to see if Eli or Gabriela have would like to talk about that question that the viewer posed, which is, again, how much did you draw from writers that have already used this pantheon versus source material? So Eli, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I don't really have anything because I've never seen the pantheon used. So no, nothing to add.
Okay, Gabriela?
I mean, I've only read like Naomi Novik and Catherine Arden after I finished writing my book, right? So, but the way I use my research is I'm a bit of a magpie. I just kind of look for shiny bits and just, so I read the stories. I read some of the stuff like Ivan Bilibin illustrated kind of Russian folk tales. So it's from Slavic revival in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But what I like to do is just be sort of inspired by certain elements of it. And like I did in the second bell, so I write about Strigas, which in Slavic mythology are basically straightforward monsters. And I just kind of turn it on its head a little bit. And I kind of write about how a child that was born as Striga would be seen by the community it was born in. And and how such a child obviously presumably would have a mother, and I was interested so what would the mother do with the pressure of a kind of community's disapproval and the taboo of holding on to such a child. So that was my starting point. So I take the Slavic myths, but I kind of try to preserve the feel of them and the atmosphere and the kind of certain elements more than sticking very closely. And I have that freedom because, who's going to tell me otherwise? It's like,
exactly.
5 different versions. And, in one book, like Veles is the, one of the 2 major gods, god of the underworld. And, and in the other source text, he's a god of cattle. So there is no such, we don't have this kind of like, I don't know, like Ares was the god of war, and don't you dare make him the I don't know, florist. I don't have that, so I can be quite loose with it.
Really quick, we have about 10 minutes, and I want to let our viewers know, actually, we probably won't have time to answer questions and have you guys talk about where your books are available. So what I would like you guys to do after we're done here is on the YouTube channel for this panel, drop links to where your books are at, or a social media place that you would like people to find you, so that people can find your books. We've got a lot of people in the chat actually talking about how they want to read your stuff. So authors, this is your chance. Put the links in the chat so that they can find your books, and I'm going to be scouring them as well. But before we end, I do want to ask, and Antoine, I'm going to have you be the first person to answer this.
Okay.
The mythologies that you guys are using, are any aspects of them still being practiced today? Or do we see parts of them being practiced today and we just don't know it? Antoine, you go ahead.
Very much so. So it is, I think there are something like 2 million active practitioners of IFA or some sort of branch of IFA, because like I was saying before, it has branched out in the Americas. So that is why I'm very, very careful with how I use it. Because while yes, I am making a fantasy story out of it, I still want to make sure that I'm not just totally taking a character and making them completely outside of what they originally were intended to be in that original mythology. So what I do for that is have beta readers and sensitivity readers of those specific people who are under those practices. And so far, like, the betas that I have had to read it have all said, okay, this is a good job. Like, we understand that, it's a fantasy and we get that, but as long as like the actual gods or whatever it is that we're doing with the deities are accurate, to how they are, portrayed. So I would say that is like the most important thing for me, is just to make sure that I'm having these people read my material so that I'm not completely off, but still very much still, telling a fantasy story that I, want to tell.
Awesome. And just for our viewers really quickly, Antoine is going to have to leave us in just a couple of minutes. So if you have a question for him specifically, you got to get it in now. Anybody else want to talk about how their mythologies might still be practiced today? How do you handle that with sensitivity? Just raise your hand. Let me know. Anybody?
There is a kind of modern paganism, but it's reconstructive. So we don't actually know what the religion used to be before the advent of Christianity. So it's all reconstructive paganism. It's not something, I would be particularly worried about. And when it comes to, there are certain sort of folkloric elements, and there's this, like there's certain holidays during a year where you kind of do the old rites in one way or another, in very fairly limited form, like, pouring wax through the opening in a key to sort of try and divine the name of your future intended or something like that. So there are certain superstitions and certain small rites, but they a lot of them have lost their spiritual and their religious dimension. So it's folkloric rather than religious or mythological now. So it's it's open season for Slavic things. You can write whatever you want.
It sounds like they've adapted it. I think of a lot of times during this panel, I thought of Bridget and how Bridget has evolved, saint and goddess and all these kinds of things, and how people still basically, like, they keep the flame of Bridget going, but it's like this evolution of religion and worship. And it sounds very similar, where the myths have been taken and then it's
impossible to separate past a certain point, like you don't know how much of the way we celebrate Easter is to do with a sort of old goddess of spring or whatever. I mean, we don't know how which of the saints were actually Christian and which ones were the gods.
Yeah,
it's impossible to tell unless unless we come across like a horde of archaeological finds. It's very difficult to piece together in a very in a way that's certain, in a way that you can't, this is clearly written here in black and white, like Ellie was saying, that they are very clear and very Mesopotamian records of the stories and of how people worshipped and all that. Like this is just a lot of it's conjecture, educated guesses, and you look to the kind of the source materials are folk tales. So and then they often as well have a sort of added dimension of a kind of later layering. So it's hard to separate that.
Real quick before we go, I think a lot of our viewers would love to explore some of these pantheons a little bit more. So starting with Antoine, because I know you have a hard out at noon, could you tell us maybe one or two resources really quickly that people could look at and read to find out more about your pantheon?
Oh, I should have brought my book with me, but if you go on Amazon or Google and look up anything about the Orishas or the Yoruba people, particularly there's a book called Yoruba Ritual. You'll find a lot of the pantheons in there. One overlap that me and James have, Thor and Shango are very similar. They're both the deities of thunder, which is, I love the overlap of everybody like that. And then that's probably the most famous one you'll find is like Shango, but then Yamoja or Yamaya. And also they have different names too. So like if you find all these different names, that's just going to happen because some of it's influenced by Portuguese or it's influenced by English or Spanish. So like you'll find like 3 different names for each of them. No, probably like at least 4 for like each of them. So watch out for that too, and different spellings and things like that.
Okay, great.
But yeah, Yoruba Ritual for sure.
Okay. Eli, any resources that you could give people about Mesopotamian pantheon?
Yes. So Myths from Mesopotamia is a great book. It's very cheap. It's been out for quite a while. It's an Oxford World Classic. This was like $5 on Amazon, but buy from a local bookstore if you can. And a lot of these are just online for free. The Descent of Inanna you can find online for free. This isn't specific to the Mesopotamian pantheon, but the Goddess's Mirror is great, especially for overlap. I mean, they have accounts from India, the Levant, they have Freya, Japanese goddesses, Greco-Roman goddesses, and they talk about a lot of the source myths and how they're quite similar and how there's a great deal of overlap. So this is just general mythology, but Myths from Mesopotamia would be my biggest recommendation. Awesome.
James, any recommendations for Norse mythology for our viewers?
The touchstone is always going to be the Icelandic sagas. The Icelandic people were, direct descendants or, immigrants from Scandinavia, and they took the culture with them and transformed it in their own way. But Snorri's sagas and the Poetic Edda and things like that are the place to go if you really want to get into it. But if you want to just know more about the culture, there's an excellent website called Hurstwic, HURSTWIC.com, where they talk about the culture, and they talk about a lot of things that you will definitely not have heard about before, like how they combed their hair and their daily kind of washing, and they were very fastidious, clean, neat people. Took a lot of care over their hair and appearance. Some of them cut little channels into their teeth and dyed them. They took an enormous amount of care over their clothing and everything that they wore and their weaponry, and there's fascinating stuff about the culture. And they also have a lot on that site on Hurstwic about mythology and their beliefs and spiritual system, such as it is understood. So, and a little bit about combat. They do some recreation videos about combat, because it isn't smashing swords together. When you realize how expensive those swords were, even at the time, you would never ever hit them with another sword together, because you do that 3 or 4 times and the sword is ruined. And it took a master craftsman a year of his life to make. So the way that people fought in this time is also something that most people, myself included, before I started researching it, were very ignorant about. So yeah, I would that's a great starting point. Hurstwic.
Okay. And Gabriela, any resources for our viewers?
So disappointingly for some, I suppose, most of my resources are in Polish. But for anybody interested in kind of folklore and the sort of fairy tales from sort of Slavic lands, I could recommend there is an English translation of the Russian fairy tales, illustrated beautifully by Ivan Bilibin. And if you want to get like this first taste of the Baba Yaga and the Gamayu Nilva, go in that direction and sort of and take it from there. Obviously, if you Google it, you can find all kinds of books, but this would be a nice start.
Okay, great. I want to thank our amazing panelists. I think we could have gone another half hour to an hour and still not exhausted all the questions and things we all wanted to talk about.
I think we've gone through a fifth of your questions.
Yes, I think we have. Maybe we all should nudge Virginia and the other CorinCon organizers to do this again next year.
I would do this with no one watching. I just want to hear more about. I just want to hear more about these mythologies.
Yes.
Yeah, happily have a call with all of y'all. Just
chatting
amongst ourselves.
I'm not doing anything. If I'm under lockdown, I'm not doing anything if you're not.
And I also want to thank our viewers. Thank you for tuning in to this CorinCon panel. Thank you for tuning into CorinCon in general. I encourage you to check out all of our authors and their bios on the CorinCon 2021 website, and also to catch all of the other panels, workshops, and thank you everybody for being here. Have a fantastic rest of your day and check out the next panel or reading.
You too.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much, Trish.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.